The meeting of February 10th, 2016. I'm Councilman Mike Bonham, the chair of the committee. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Councilwoman Nuri Martinez of the 6th District and Councilmember Paul Koretz of the 5th District. Before we get started, let's, as is our custom, do our multimodal roll call. In the past 2 weeks, who here has commuted by bus? By train? Bus a little bit higher than train. Bicycle? Pedestrian, commuted by foot. Oh, wow. Wow, that's, I think, our highest ped count so far. Carpool, vanpool. Uber, Lyft. Segway. All right, well, we died out at the Segway. Okay, so let's get to the agenda. Colleagues, I was going to propose for consideration on a consent agenda items 1, 2, and 6, unless anybody has questions on those. All right, so we will move items 1, 2, and 6 on the consent agenda. I will then move to general public comment. We have 4 general comment cards from Steve Sue, Jonathan Ayon, Diane Valencia, and Fanny Ortiz. The 4 of you can just come up to the table if you'd like.
1 or 2 minutes, Mr. Chair.
2. And seeing no other general comment cards, general public comment is closed. Who'd like to begin?
Hi, my name is Steve, and I'm from an organization called Kiwa. We are a member of the Alliance for Community Transit Los Angeles, ACT LA. ACT LA is a coalition of 30 organizations that came together to campaign for land use standards that leads to a focus on an increase in affordable housing and quality jobs near transit. 70% of public transit commuters make less than $25,000 a year, which is extremely low income, and all too often are priced out of their neighborhoods by luxury developments. This decreases ridership, and we're seeing that in LA. We want to see a strong public transportation system that serves residents, both dependent on the system. We hope to be able to work with the city and ensure that equitable transit-oriented development is recognized as an important factor in increasing transit ridership. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Ayon. I'm with Thai Community Development Center in East Hollywood. I'm also here to represent ACT LA. So many studies have shown that locating affordable housing near transit can increase ridership, ease traffic congestion, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They also show that luxury housing development near transit can have the opposite effect. Today, 60% of housing development is being built within a half-mile of a transit station. Unfortunately, these developments are overwhelmingly luxury and market rate. A nationwide study has actually found declines in ridership after new stations open, as low-income families who use public transit more than frequently are forced and moved out and displaced. In LA County, the number of riders has decreased by about 9% in the last 2 years. That's a loss of over 130,000 weekly boardings. Alliance for Community Around Transit is here to work with you guys and sit down and continue having conversations. And we hope to work together with you and implementing equitable development, transit-oriented developments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Diane Valencia, and I'm a youth organizer with the Southeast Asian Community Alliance, SICA. And we work with many migrant youth and refugee families in Chinatown and Lincoln Heights, and we are also part of this ACT LA coalition. Many of our youth come from families that work low wage in the restaurants, sweatshop garment factories, and live in overcrowded housing. And because of economic hardships, they rely on taking public buses and the trains. And in Chinatown, we're rich transit. We have many bus lines, the Gold Line Station, the Union Station, and there's a lot of new developments, luxury homes, a lot of retail chains coming in, and it's causing rent to increase for our residents and displacing a lot of the small businesses. And our families who live next to these transit and rely on these transit are having a hard time with these changes. And we need more affordable housing in our neighborhood. And as SICA, part of this Act LA coalition, we would like to work with you all in creating more solutions, affordable, equitable, transit-oriented development in our communities.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Fanny Ortiz, and I am a member of Act LA and a TOD resident of Boyle Heights. As a TOD resident, my family and I get to explore the city by public transit. We get to walk and use our bicycles within our Boyle Heights community. The vision of Act LA focuses on affordable housing near public transit. The theory of the best uses for these new developments and how those uses fit into our overall platform and vision for equitable TOD. Avoiding displacement of families and protecting small businesses by developing affordable housing. Equitable TOD with affordable housing will ensure market rate developments do not displace the poor people of color who rely on public transit and communities that are habitable for all. Thank you.
Thank you. And just so folks understand the rules of the Brown Act, we're not allowed as a body to comment on an item that's not on the agenda, so we can't respond directly to what you said today. Let me just say, though, that I'm glad to have you here. I'd be happy to meet with you and discuss your issues further. I'd also recommend that you also do something similar and testify before the Planning and Land Use Committee, which actually makes most of the zoning decisions regarding TOD and housing, more so than this committee does. But I'd be happy to meet and discuss further.
Appreciate that.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much. Okay, that brings us to item number 3.
Item number 3 is a Harris-Dawson Buscano motion relative to requesting the city attorney to prepare and present an ordinance that would prohibit the parking of vehicles with for sale signs on the east and west sides of Normandy Avenue from Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard to the 10 Freeway.
Okay, we have one speaker card on this one, John Biondo. Good afternoon, officers. How are you?
How are you?
Thank you.
I'm Officer John Biano. I'm a senior lead officer at Southwest Area, LAPD. This is my partner, Officer Piero Lega, who's also a senior lead at LAPD. So we're here on behalf of the respective communities that borders each of our basic car areas to discuss and talk about the issues with non-licensed dealers coming from around other areas outside of Southwest and parking their vehicles on the city right away and basically selling their cars. I personally get calls about once a week from residents, whether it's business owners, sometimes it's churches, discussing the issues with being able to park their cars. Many of the residents live on the surrounding streets, but because the streets are so small and impacted, they're forced to park their cars on Normandy Avenue. And the dealers, the unlicensed dealers who park their vehicles there for sale, take up the parking places, which means that residents have to walk 2, 3, 4, 5 blocks even sometimes just to get to their homes. So we're here to support the idea of putting no parking for vehicles with for sale signs on the street so it can clear it out and make room necessary for the residents of that area.
Okay. Anything we want
Just
to
like
add?
he said, north of Jefferson in the area, they also have some one-hour parking signs that kind of help the illegal sales for that neighborhood.
Yep.
What did it push a lot of those sales down south of Jefferson Boulevard? We've done several enforcement efforts. Most recently, we did a sting operation with DMV investigators. We had some undercover officers attempt to purchase these vehicles. The suspect in this case, a seller, lived all the way on Western and Pico, and he was selling cars all the way on Normandy and Jefferson. Like he said, a resident comes home from work, 5, 6 o'clock from a long day at work. They can't park their car and take care of their needs for their family. Secondary, these cars, when they purchase them from the auction, wherever they purchase them, before they prepare them to be sold on Normandy Avenue, they do the auto repair on the street. We've tried to enforce this with illegal auto repair citations. However, what they do is they bring in mechanics from all over the city. So if I cite a person for fixing a car, the person running this operation will just hire another person to fix the car, and I'll have to write a ticket for another person. So that ticket I'm writing to curb the illegal auto repair is not going to our problem person. So we think something like as simple as a sign could really help out our enforcement efforts in that area.
Okay. I also note I had another public comment card on this one. You guys can stay put for just a second if you don't mind. Noe Guzman from Braggs Family Motors. Please, come on up. Hi.
Prefiero hablar en español. You got some translator?
Do we have a...
Yo le puedo interpretar.
Okay.
¿Cómo se llama?
Noé Guzmán,
My name is Noel Guzmán.
represento Bright Family Motors.
Yo represento a Blythe
Bright Family Motors.
Family Motors.
El problema de nosotros es que tenemos muchos carros de venta enfrente del dealer.
Un momentito. The problem that we're having is that we have a lot of cars in front of our dealership.
Y esto nos afecta en las ventas.
And this affects our sales.
Y cuando estas personas venden los carros en la calle, les garantizan que son carros del dealer y estas personas llegan a reclamar
momentito.
haciendo complaints.
Un momentito. A lot of these people who buy these cars off the street, they're guaranteed that these cars are coming from a dealership.
Y nosotros tenemos, no nos dejan estacionamientos en ningún lado de la calle.
And we're having trouble finding parking for any of our vehicles anywhere on the street.
Is he in favor of the proposal? Or...
¿Está a favor de la proposición o está en contra? ¿Usted está en favor?
De que quiten los carros de venta, sí.
Sí. He's in favor to take away the cars that are for sale. Yes.
Okay. Great. Okay.
Es todo.
Gracias.
That's it.
Great.
Gracias, señor.
Ask a few questions of the officers as well, just to...
Yes, let me just first ask, is...
Can I
Council
translate that for just a second?
Oh.
El señor va a hacer unas preguntas de los oficiales si quiere mantener ahí. Do you have questions for him as well, or just for the officers?
Just for the officers.
Bueno, ya se puede sentar. Son nomás las preguntas para los oficiales. Gracias, señor.
And is Council District 8 here? Come on.
Steve Garcia from the Office of Councilmember Marquise Harris Dawson.
And you're...
We are full support of this. Yes.
Mr. Nagel?
Yes, officers, when you, is this the same dealer, or are there numerous dealers that are selling multiple cars at this location?
Numerous.
Okay. And you talked about they're actually doing auto repairs in the street. Are they leaving car parts or oil residue and all that? So it's basically blighting the area?
Correct.
Okay.
And what happens also, they lift it up on jacks and they can't finish the repair in one day. It stays there on the street, blocking someone's residence.
And have the residents actually had any altercations with them, or have there been fights or anything that you know of?
Not in my particular case, not fights necessarily. They're afraid to encounter them because they hang out or congregate in one certain section. So they're afraid to approach them. They're afraid to say anything. So they reach out to us for a solution.
And have you had numerous has the council office had numerous complaints from the residents and businesses there complaining
Yeah.
about the inability to park?
We have.
Okay.
Mr. Kretz?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. I've had to deal with this kind of thing a couple times in my district. It's a huge nuisance, but probably in your case where they're actually doing auto work and you have to cite the people doing the work, it's kind of unfair because they've been asked to go over there and do the work. It's really the people that are paying them that should be cited, but there's probably no legal way for us to do that. So really the way to handle this is as is proposed to do the right kind of signage and make it clearly illegal to have them there.
I just want to add one thing, if I may.
Sure.
So, like Mr. Correz, I've had to deal with the same issue in my district. The only thing that I would recommend is they just go somewhere else. That's just part of the problem. So what we've had to do is expand, the number of streets where they are now relocated and perhaps add an extra mile, especially along Van Nuys Boulevard. So that's my only recommendation is usually the problem just moves somewhere else. If not, they just move down the street to just right past the postings that you.
That's an excellent point. And so the stretch from the 10 freeway to King Boulevard is quite large. they do the sales intermittently along that area. So to avoid exactly what you're talking about, when I wrote the letter suggesting it, I made it from the 10 freeway all the way to King, which is where we see the problem most often. But it's something great to keep in mind, and we'll expand it if we have the opportunity.
If
this
evidence
was also
comes
a
in
result
that
of-
says that,
Excuse me?
we would need evidence of that. If they expand to another area, you would have to come back again to describe the problems in that area. But
Well, I'm not suggesting you expand it now. What I'm saying is, in the future, if the problem were to move to a different location or just basically down the street, that's what, I've had to encounter that. So it's just sort of like an FYI, but obviously they're ahead of the game, so.
And have you found, Councilmember Martinez, that when these are enacted at the specific locations, that they alleviate the problem in your district?
It does. It just takes the city a long time to actually come up with the postings.
But it
I
does
think it
work.
takes longer to actually put the signs up, and that becomes frustrating, so that we've had to wait a little longer than we wanted to on that, but we've definitely seen the difference in the number of cars that are being either repaired on the street or being sold. A lot of these people innocently go and purchase a car, and a lot of the times these cars have been, in very serious collisions and traffic accidents, and so they're not purchasing a car that's necessarily good enough to run, and people are getting ripped off left and right. So. That's
Thank
it.
you. Okay, thank you. Do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Seconded? Without objection, the item is approved. Thank you very much. Thank you, officers. Okay, that brings us to item number 4.
Item number 4 is a Bond and O'Farrell motion relative to directing DOT with the Bureau of Engineering to report in regard to Caltrans requirements for relinquishing State Route 187 between Lincoln Boulevard and Cadillac Avenue and State Route 1 between the southern city limits of City of Santa Monica and State Route 105.
Great. If DOT and BOE could come to the table. Good afternoon. I think this will be a brief item, I hope. This is an item in my district. Last year, the state legislature, at my request, authorized the beginning of relinquishment proceedings so that the city of Los Angeles can get back Venice Boulevard and Lincoln Boulevard in my district. Venice Boulevard, in particular, is of interest because it is one of the 15 great streets in the city of Los Angeles, and for us to make it great, we need to get out of sort of the older style of thinking that Caltrans has. And Lincoln Boulevard in particular is important because it is actually Pacific Coast Highway and is a scenic highway, and there is no one who has driven the stretch of it in Marina del Rey or Venice who would ever consider it scenic by any stretch of the imagination. So we're eager to get both of these back, and my understanding is that we were supposed to have responded to comments in early January to Caltrans, and I'm checking to see if we have that report done yet.
Good afternoon. This is Jeannie Park speaking on behalf of the Bureau of Engineering. So we met, my colleague Michael Hunt from the Department of Transportation, I've met today with Caltrans, and they have affirmed that our comments have been received and that the draft RAR report is now being considered in Sacramento, and they expect that to report back to the city in March.
So the comments were received by Caltrans when?
This is Michael Hunt from LADOT. The comments were actually given back in October. We were going to follow up with additional comments if we had any. It turned out that the city didn't have any additional comments, so Caltrans moved forward with the comments that we had at the time. So that's where we're at. They moved forward with the comments that we gave them, so we're good.
Okay, that's not the understanding we had from Caltrans. We will confirm that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to continue this item 2 weeks to make sure that that's the case. In the meantime, I would like to get a schedule of negotiations with Caltrans, and I'd like my office to be present at all of those, or at least consulted on all of them, and be an integral part of those conversations.
Just a quick update. We actually started negotiations this morning with Caltrans to find out kind of some wiggle room where they're at so that we can actually have that conversation with your office.
Okay, yeah, I'd definitely like my office to be engaged. You should know, after the last El Nino storms, that Venice Boulevard, which was recently repaved by Caltrans, so we thought, this would be a great time to take it back, has at least a dozen and a half pretty big potholes on it. So we want to make sure that they're taking care of that before we get it back. Okay.
So noted.
So we'll continue for 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings us to item number 5.
Item number 5 is a Bon and Weezer motion relative to directing DOT to report on the implementation of bicycle infrastructure in the city.
Great. While Ms. Reynolds comes to the table, let me just introduce this, colleagues. This was a motion I submitted to get an update from Department of Transportation on implementation of bicycle infrastructure in the city. The city approved a citywide bicycle master plan under my predecessor, the previous chair of this committee, Mr. Rosendahl. The city has since updated its bicycle planning in the Mobility Plan 2035, and DOT and Ms. Reynolds have been working hard on this. We wanted to get an update, particularly wanted to get a sense from her about where we are on the issue of doing quantity of bike infrastructure versus quality of bike infrastructure, and where we were on trying to build out a transition from a system right now that is really only used by the fearless, as opposed to everyday residents of Los Angeles. And I think that was one of our goals, is to build out a system that people would feel safe and comfortable using, as opposed to just the evil Knievels of our roadway.
Great. So I don't know, it's a little bright, but I don't know how the lights are in here. So I'll just
Can we dim the lights?
Move through the slides and see how it goes. And really, this is meant to start to help set a framework to help the sort of policymakers understand why the decisions and the design decisions that we're making are changing, and why we're doing things differently now than we were even just a few years ago. And it's just to start out to say this is really not about the bike. We have a lot of goals for this city that are ambitious. We want to be sustainable, we want to be prosperous, we want to be safe, we want to be healthy. And we know that investment in a broad array of transportation choices and changing the way we think about our streets is a quick way to get there. And when we think about cities that we love, typically they are places that we enjoy walking and that we enjoy biking. They're places that start out in their design decisions by thinking about how does this work for children? How does this work for older adults? How does it work for the sort of most vulnerable among us? And that includes considerations around economics. So there's multiple studies now repeated over and over again, Australia, Portland, Seattle, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, that people driving spend less than people biking, and people walking, and people who take transit. And that's because typically in neighborhoods that are bikeable and walkable, these folks are making multiple trips. If you drive, you may show up once a week or once a month to do a large shopping, but if you're biking and walking in your neighborhood, you're going back to these stores over and over again. So month over month, people who bike and walk are spending more than people who drive. So we know that there is a strong economic reason and argument to make places better for bicycling and walking. This is work from Seattle. The green line is local sales tax receipt returns on a street, Northeast 65th Street. The big green line is when they installed a protected bikeway, and the sort of green line shows the return and the sort of the way that helped that particular neighborhood thrive. This is work from San Francisco, analyzing local sales tax receipts. So we're talking about small stores, we're talking about mom and pop, local businesses, looking at streetscape projects around the city, and discovering that in 7 out of 8 of them, where we had made investments to make better places better to bike or walk, those businesses kept pace with or outperformed their competitors on other neighborhood streets in the neighborhood and in the city. So we know that there is a correlation between making places, making these kinds of investments and seeing the return on them literally in dollars. But money's not the only thing we care about. We care about community happiness and social cohesion. We care about people being connected to their neighbors. And this is work from Europe looking at the emotions that people associate with different modes of transportation. So red is car, green is bike, yellow is public transit. And you can see that for whatever reason, that public transit negative association is really strong. We're going to work on that, that people people associate aversion, sadness, and anger with public transit. And joy is most closely associated with driving and biking. And that's, when people think about biking, it takes them back to a time when biking represented independence from their families. Oftentimes the first time that you can get out on your own is when you take a bike ride. And we don't have enough fun in transportation. And so when we think about bringing in things that people associate with positive emotions, bicycling performs really well.
What's the source of that last slide?
I can send it to you. It's the Dutch consulate.
Okay. I'd like to bring that to my next Metro board meeting.
Great. Sounds super. So this is now, let's just talk a little bit about what that's like in Los Angeles and bust a few myths. So this is a map of car-free households, and you see that the darker colors represent households that don't have access to vehicles. We have a third of the households in and around downtown that literally don't have access to a car. And we know when we look at actual commute numbers, and the left is the map showing where we have high numbers of people biking, that there are already neighborhoods in Los Angeles where lots of people are choosing to bike as regular everyday transportation in downtown, on the west side, and a sweet little outpost in the valley as well, for whatever reason. We talked to a lot of folks in focus groups around Los Angeles, a little over 700. These are folks across every age and income level from different neighborhoods around the city, and also across a spectrum of bicycle use. So some of these folks are everyday commuters, but most of them either own a bike and haven't used it in a really long time, don't own a bike, or rarely bike. So we're testing attitudes and behaviors around what people think the city should be doing to invest in this infrastructure, and you see overwhelming agreement that the city should make biking safer for everybody, and that we should add bike lanes to more streets. Now, I know that when things go from the global to the personal, these pie charts change, but I think it's important to remind ourselves that the majority of folks out there agree that we should be making these kinds of investments. And that they also feel like bike lanes protect everyone. They bring order and organization to chaos on the streets. And so we know that when you're people bicycling need bikeways to sort of feel respect and feel like they have a place on the street. People driving need bike lanes so that they get predictability and that there's organization. Bicycling is the mode of transportation that has grown the most, and as more and more people are on the streets bicycling, they become more difficult for everybody to navigate. So who's out there right now? And we think about how to get more people biking or how to bring that into people's everyday transportation choices. This is a sort of broadly accepted spectrum of the universe, right? So on the left, you've got the fast and fearless. They're also known as mammals, middle-aged men in Lycra. And then and just to pause there and say, the people bicycling now tend to be on either extreme end of the income spectrum, right? So you've got the folks who do it for sport. They are called vehicular cyclists. They are aggressive. They are comfortable cutting it up in traffic. And then you've got people who rely on bicycling for their primary mode of transportation. And they're usually relegated to the sidewalk, and they're usually riding the wrong way, and they usually don't have a helmet on. In the sort of yellow bar there, we've got a small percentage of folks who are sort of, confident enough to get out on a bike lane. Then on the far right, you've got no way, no how. So these are folks who don't bicycle now, have no interest in bicycling, and they may be for a whole host of reasons. They're older adults, they're maybe people with disabilities, et cetera. But then it's this huge, mushy middle that we're interested in. And we know that this is mostly women in this green bar. Men outnumber women on the streets on bikes by about 3 to 1. We know it's children. We know it's also older adults. And so we need to think about, how do we change the design paradigm to go from, what we've been doing up until now has been pretty good, good enough to get this guy out on his bike. But how do we go from designing for sort of the other to designing for, my mother? And this has been our toolbox, right? And these are things that are familiar to everybody. A situation where you've got nothing between you and moving traffic but this 4-inch white fog line, or where you've got something that some would argue is even less powerful, which is the Sharrow. There was another study that came out last week about the relative sort of lack of utility of Sharrows. And we really weren't getting past that 1 to 2% with this toolbox in the U.S. in the last 40 or 50 years. So we end up with a situation like this. We go out to a neighborhood and say, well, I want to put something in here to make it easier for people to bike, and you get this answer. And it's sort of a predictable outcome for the sort of a limited toolbox we had. But what would our streets look like if this was our design vehicle? If we were trying to design a street that this woman and her kids feel comfortable riding their bike on to go to school, for everyday errands, to go to the donut shop on the weekend, to go out for a date with her wife or her husband. In 2008, New York City really changed the game. They threw out the rule book. They completely rethought the way that the design toolbox should work in the United States. So this is an avenue in Midtown where they've got a protected bikeway, they've got parked cars, they've got a nice buffer here, they've got a transit-only lane here on the right-hand side of the street. And the minute that they did this, it released this huge pent-up latent demand to do this kind of design. And we now have over 200 of these in the United States that are either in design or on the streets. And you see them all across the country, from Texas to California, Montana. It's not just big cities that are designing these kinds of things. It's everybody, because it meets this need that had been pent up for a long time. And we've got our own projects coming. This is the MyFig project. Here is Reseda and Northridge before and after, where we put the city's first parking protected bikeway. And so the reason why we're trying to design to this level is really to try and attract those folks who are interested but concerned. And we know from research that these lanes increase overall numbers of bicyclists, but in particular increase the number of older people and women riding their bikes. So now we understand a little bit better about the different levels of traffic stress, right? Here's level 1, where you'd feel comfortable sending your kids out. Level 2 is where, adults, including casual cyclists, would feel comfortable riding. This is level 3. We've got the enthused and confidence, and here's level 4, where only sort of the fast and fearless will feel comfortable. So when you map this out, this is really relevant for Los Angeles. This is a map of the low-stress network in the city of San Jose. You'd never design a street network for cars that looked like this. You see, there are whole neighborhoods where they're disconnected, because what they did is they lit up all of the streets that are relatively easy to ride on, pretty comfortable to ride on as they are today, and they blanked out all of the big arterials that do not meet that same kind of definition. And so what you get are a lot of these little islands where if you could provide some connection here and make some of these investments to close these gaps, you could have a pretty great network for everybody. This is Long Beach. So this is a facility called Neighborhood Greenway. And these are streets where you see there's really not a lot of design, heavy design on the street itself, but at the intersections, the traffic is calmed and the access is somewhat limited. This is actually in Hollywood, in Los Angeles. We have our own neighborhood greenway here as well. And these kinds of investments are expensive, but they are relatively light touch, and they make these streets better to walk on, better to bike on, better to live on, and they require less sort of arduous outreach. And then we have these little gap closures, right? So adding bike signals where they don't exist so that motorists have to stop while people biking and walking get their own turn. This is a one-block project to close a gap, to create a little protected bikeway that's a contraflow. So this is a one-way street, and there was a great bike lane on either end, but then this little middle section fell apart. So I just wanted to sort of close by sort of bringing it back to our strategic plan and why we changed our metric from building 40 miles of bike lanes to building 10 miles of protected bikeways and neighborhood greenways. And that is because I think that we have to start with neighborhood-focused, extremely high-quality infrastructure, acknowledging that that is going to be more expensive, potentially more complex, and call on us to overcome skepticism about whether or not Los Angeles can ever be a place where people really want to bike. But this is just the last reminder is that, my ongoing question about whether or not engineering can teach people good manners. I predominantly over my entire career, the number one thing I hear is, those bicyclists need to learn how to obey the rules of the road. And if they're getting involved in crashes, it's their own fault because they're running stop signs and running traffic signals and on and on and on. Well, what we know is that when Chicago put in bike signals on Dearborn Avenue, they brought the number of bicyclists running red lights, they cut it by 80%. And we know that when New York put in their protected bikeways, they reduced sidewalk bike riding to almost nothing. If we want people to behave in a dignified way, the infrastructure needs to treat them with dignity. So it's difficult for us to overcome. Engineering has its limits. But we really do, if we want to see everybody get safely where they're going and get to some of these really challenging outcomes that we have, we need to refocus on providing this kind of design on our streets. So that's it. I'm happy to take questions if you have them.
Thank you. Actually, I think, well, this is an exciting idea for me because I'm in the mushy middle ground. I don't mind riding a bicycle, but I have no skill in avoiding cars whatsoever. The last time I took a good long ride was on Carmageddon, where I rode from home to the site of a press conference and back, and I really came pretty close to getting myself killed. I actually did have a car that hit my clothing that was sticking out, but didn't actually hit me. Pretty typical. So I think this is exciting, and I mean, really the last time I did any significant cycling was about 20 years ago when I was training for the California AIDS ride, and we trained in packs. So again, I was much safer because people could see 30 cyclists. There aren't a lot of opportunities in LA. You have the opportunity around the Orange Line, and we'll have it once we get together with the Expo line and close the gaps, which unfortunately I think are mostly going to be in my district, so we're trying to help close those. I think for people that at least cycle for recreation but are nervous cyclists, the trick is to how to get to those, because those are pretty lengthy opportunities. But once Expo opens up, I don't know if I can even find a safe route from around the Beverly Center all the way to around Jefferson. Are we looking at this for those kinds of opportunities, for recreational opportunities? Are we mostly focused on getting people on routes that they can use to work or school? What's our focus on this?
My sort of perspective on that is that it's a really tall ask to expect somebody who rides occasionally or doesn't ride at all or puts their bike in their car to drive to a trail, for example, to get them to go from that to commuting to work. Which is why, I'm trying to bring the focus and the emphasis back to those neighborhood scale trips, because it's actually a much easier ask to say, if you had a neighborhood greenway or a protected bikeway connection to go out for a date in your, to a restaurant in your neighborhood, of a mile or so or under a mile, you might consider it versus sort of our automatic get in the car and drive there. So to start, I'm trying to focus on these neighborhood connections and short trips. So we know that, 47% of all the trips in Los Angeles are under 3 miles, and whether it's a connection to a really strong trail spine that people can then use for a longer haul, or a connection to a new transit station that's opening, those are valuable, and we need to focus on how can we make those connections for people, because it's that weakest link in their trip that causes them to decide not to sort of throw up their hands and say, I'm not even going to bother because it's great in my neighborhood, but then I got to get across Sunset at at an intersection that doesn't have a signal, and I won't do it. So I'm trying to find those targeted investments that we can make to help attack the short trips first.
Have we looked at how much activity we're getting on the really good locations like the Orange Line, where you have an extended protected stretch?
We do. So we work with LACB, the Los Angeles County Bike Coalition, and other partners to take counts. And I know that's something that the chair has been really keenly interested in, is getting the department to a place where we're able to have a really robust data collection program. And so we do work with them to get counts now, but we want to get to a place where we're doing those counts, and where we're collecting them, maybe we don't have to collect them manually anymore. We have a video counter, or we have other ways to automate that. So those are things that we're working on to try and gather better data.
And a great location like that, have we done anything to market it? Because I have no idea beyond regular cyclists and their organizational reach, whether just regular people in the valley realize that they've got a really good protected stretch of bike lane.
I think that you've hit on something that is really key, which is how do we normalize bicycling? How do we make it seem like something that is easy for anybody to do and not sort of just relegated to, hardcore recreational enthusiasts? And that is, there's a program in the city of Portland and Seattle and Vancouver where there's a more thoughtful way to market these things to people who could use them as they're making their trip choices. So we've done a bit, and I know that a lot of our partners in the sort of advocacy world and nonprofit world have done a bit, but it's going to take a much bigger, sort of smarter effort to really get the word out about the assets we already have.
And how does Sharrows work? Because I've always wondered that myself. Are they actually encouraging cycling to any great degree? Are they reducing accidents to any great degree?
So there's varying opinions on this. I'll give you mine, which is based on a number of different studies I've seen and long work. Actually put in some of the very first Sharrows in California back when I worked for the city of Oakland. And what they really are best for is wayfinding, I think. And maybe originally they were what we used them for was to try and get bicyclists out of the door zone and to tell drivers that bicyclists were allowed to take the lane where you might have a block or two, or it's too narrow to put in a bike lane, but you wanted to provide that connection. They're okay for that if you're already a strong and confident bicyclist. They're not really a meaningful infrastructure investment unless you're using them. Say you have a route that goes through a residential neighborhood and it turns a few times. Sharrows are really useful for wayfinding, to sort of leave those breadcrumbs for cyclists to show them how they navigate, that sort of low-stress route through a neighborhood. Or if you're trying to help them get across a really difficult and challenging intersection, placing the Sharrows in the intersection to sort of guide the person on the bike where to best position themselves safely. And they've been shown to be effective that way. But I don't think of them as a real infrastructure tool, particularly on a busier, higher volume, higher speed street.
So where we try to provide connectivity, a couple miles of Sharrows probably aren't realistically as helpful
Depends
as
on the
I had
street,
hoped.
but I would say, they're not a substitute, especially on, the busier the street, the more traffic turbulence there is on the street, the more separation we want to try and provide for people. So they may be okay in a neighborhood street or maybe for a block or two, but they're not a great sort of, long corridor solution for a busier street.
Very good.
Yeah, I just want to make two suggestions. I think when you do the community outreach piece, focusing more on talking about the safety and the number of crash incidents in the area is important, and I don't think that's being discussed when proposals like this are being, visited in these areas. I know that in my district, that goes a long way. If you tell people how many people have been run over, people get that. They probably know someone that did. And so I think the message needs to be more focused in terms of my community, in terms of safety. It's a real safety issue for some of these areas, and the number of crash incidents is important as well. So that's what's worked for me. But it does help for the department to also reiterate that, and not because lately it's been falling on me to have to do that, and I have to do a lot of the cleanup, which I don't necessarily mind, but I think the talking points need to be there. And the second thing is, in terms of when we're looking into designing and implementing infrastructure, we need to meet families' needs. I mean, children and families are how we should be designing some of this stuff, especially how does this fit into our public libraries, our parks? Are these things being designed with children and families in mind? In my district, I see men riding bikes, a few women. Rarely do I ever see a family on a bike lane. In fact, I don't think I have. It's scary. I'm terrified of letting my kid go from my house and ride her bike for 3 blocks to get to the park. I mean, I literally have to sit there and, walk her through what she needs to do and be on my husband to make sure nothing happens to her. So, and when we design, our infrastructure around our city, I think we need to take all that stuff into consideration, because a lot of my families they just don't take advantage of our bike lanes because it's scary.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point, and definitely the reason why we're trying to look at different kinds of solutions, because if we keep on doing things the way we've been doing things, there'll be more of the same. We're gonna get the same sort of very small percentage of people that feel comfortable enough to be out in the bike lanes, but we're gonna have large swaths of the city that are not gonna have that choice as a regular everyday transportation option. And to your first point, the focus of Vision Zero work, which is to get to zero traffic deaths by 2025, is to first start with focusing on the most vulnerable users, people walking and biking, and start there as the starting point for the community conversation. So I appreciate the point, and hopefully we can do a better job in the future.
That's it, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Reynolds.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will receive and file that item. And that concludes our regular agenda, am I correct? All right, so we will adjourn the regular, I'm sorry, we had before we receive and file, we will unreceive and unfile. Mr. Heineman had a public comment. I'm sorry about that.
This is Dennis Hyman. I agree what Salita said, but I have a few other items to add to what has been done in the city. The city of Los Angeles had 2 periods of time in the last 7 years where bicycle commuting increased rapidly. And it's interesting to compare the 2 periods of time to see what effect separation of bicycles had on safety and volume of bicycling. According to the Census Bureau household surveys, bicycle commuting increased 56% from 2008 through 2009 as a likely result of gasoline prices rising sharply in 2008. Bicycle collisions reported by the LAPD during that time increased 46%. An average of 8 to 10 miles of bike lanes were installed per year during that time period. During fiscal years 2012 through 2014, there were 190 miles of bike lanes installed. Bicycle commuting increased 41% from 2013 through 14, and bicycle collisions reported by the LAPD fell almost 5%. LAPD collisions data is only complete for the first 6 months of 2015, and commuting data for 2015 is not yet available. Total collisions are up 11% compared to the first 6 months of 2014. Pedestrian-involved collisions increased 6%, but the bicycle reported collisions decreased 6%. This collision and bicycle commuting data strongly indicates that there is a strong correlation between increasing bicycle commuting and a lower rate of bicycle-involved collisions with motor vehicles after bicycle lanes were installed. And this is just a very simple form of separation for motor vehicles on major streets, which are mainly just where the parked car doors swing open, and yet it still increased the bicycling and decreased the collisions for bicycles. Thank you.
Okay, so we will receive and file that item. Thank you, Dennis. And we will adjourn the regular meeting, and we will convene the special meeting with our single item.
Item number 1 is a DOT report and resolution relative to the implementation of school safety zone speed limits in connection with the Safe Routes to School strategic plan.
Mr. Gale.
Just by way of introduction for this item, this sort of effort is something that a lot of cities in California have undertaken in the last few years to try and attempt to bring down speeds around schools to protect the most vulnerable users. And we all know that just putting up a sign that says 15 miles an hour is not necessarily going to result in people slowing down. So what this is for us is a big opportunity to demonstrate the kind of partnership with enforcement that we hope to see under the city's Vision Zero initiative. So the idea is that the department is working very closely with Los Angeles Police Department to first issue warnings and to get out the word and to educate parents and work closely, as we have done up until this point, with LA Unified School District to first and foremost use this as an education opportunity to raise awareness about the consequences of actions around schools. We all know that school zones, a school is like having a miniature special event twice a day. And, over the years, doing a lot of Safe Routes to School work, it can be chaotic, it can be disjointed, it can be frustrating, and it can feel very unsafe. And so first and foremost, we're working with the schools, the police department, and DOT to try and get the word out and share information about slowing down and behaving differently around schools. So this is a pilot. We're collecting lots of before and after data, and we're hoping that we can show kind of a sustained, relatively low-cost improvement in both safety outcomes and just a better overall experience going to and from school for everyone.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Nat Gale, Senior Project Coordinator for Vision Zero at the Department of Transportation. Just want to reiterate what General Manager Reynolds said. This is a pilot program. These schools were selected based on very specific criteria. Obviously, the criteria that's in existing state law was the first thing that went into consideration, but other criteria included where some of these schools have been awarded for funding for infrastructure projects. So this gives us an opportunity to measure this approach prior to those infrastructure improvements being put in place. So we can, again, evaluate based on that before and after data whether or not this is an approach we want to recommend for citywide. And want to look at doing at other schools as well. So we're excited to have this opportunity to look at, again, before and after data and really evaluate this approach and make recommendations for other schools and other locations around the city.
So there's 11 schools or street segments. None of them are in CD5, CD6, or CD11. What about the criteria foreclose the opportunity for ones in districts represented by members of the committee?
Sure. So the state law that allows cities to do this, AB 321, first looks at specific criteria in terms of the types of streets. So it has to be a local street with 2 lanes in each direction. So it couldn't be a school that is surrounded by arterials, for example. So that was the first criteria that had to be looked at. But the second, again, in terms of making this a pilot program that is effective, that gives us meaningful information, we wanted to look at schools that had been previously awarded funding for infrastructure that could follow this enforcement and education approach. So where there will be speed humps or roundabouts that were awarded through prior funding cycles based on school travel plans that were developed. So I assure you that schools in all of your districts will get those same travel plans and will get similar infrastructure further down the line, but these schools are already teed up for that.
And again, all of these schools are ones that have received Safe Route for School grant money previously?
Correct.
Okay. And why was the determination made to make that one of the criteria?
So because again, understanding that this infrastructure is to follow, your hope with that infrastructure is that driver behavior will change and people will be slowing down anyway, so that these new speed limits around schools are coming before that driver behavior change, and we can again evaluate whether that the new speed limit signs in combination with having LAPD and LA school officers out there issuing warnings and letting people know that this speed limit change has happened will be enough to change driver behavior so that we can look at doing it elsewhere across the city.
Right, and we might decide that some of those infrastructure investments could go to other schools because they're no longer needed because we found a more cost-effective way to get to the same outcome.
Right.
But I think the other thing that that we looked at were, the reason why those schools are getting Safe Routes money is because they were identified as one of the top 50 schools for negative safety outcomes, so crashes, and also high numbers of children and students already walking to school, and also high numbers of students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. So looking at sort of an equity lens, and they have school travel plans developed, and that's what queued them up for the infrastructure improvements, and so that's what sort of dropped them in this bucket. But we would be more than happy to go back and take a fresh look at that if any of you feel like there's a school or two in your district that you'd like to have included as a pilot. This is our proposal for the schools that we thought sort of would be the most meaningful for us in terms of giving us data, and also maybe offer the opportunity to reinvest dollars elsewhere if they weren't needed in terms of infrastructure.
It all makes complete sense to me. The only question I had on it, and I'm trying to think through the effectiveness of the pilot and whether and how well it measures what we think it measures. If there, I mean, I know that there's a school of thought that says that posting speed limit signs in and of itself is not that effective, and that the design and infrastructure of the street really determines what the prevailing speed is going to be. So if we're matching this program with streets that are getting some infrastructure improvements through the Safe Routes to Schools, it really will probably only tell us about how effective this is for areas that have some infrastructure improvement. It won't.
Well, we're going to do this before the infrastructure
Right.
goes in.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So first we measure, this is our first swing at it, and if this works, maybe we don't need to put
Got it.
the same level of infrastructure in. So these are schools that haven't yet, they're teed up for it, but they don't have it yet, the infrastructure.
Which again is why the item's before you now, because we want the signs, pending approval of this approach, we would want to put signs up before the school year ends. And the infrastructure will not come until probably end of 2016, early 2017. So yeah, I mean, of course, also part of the analysis in terms of picking these schools is that engineering studies were done to show that crashes are happening on these corridors as well. So to Councilmember Martinez's point, safety is the biggest issue here.
But I can't be the only one communicating that after the fact.
Yeah.
Can I just ask just one more thing? So I know the department has expressed that one way to get the word out is working with the council offices or working with the school directly to get the word out. I just don't think that's enough. We have to just do a better job of explaining why these changes are taking place, being very specific about the state legislation that enables us to then change the speed. But, just based on Chase bike lanes alone, that is on Chase Street in Panorama City. The school is Chase Elementary School. There was no communication whatsoever with the school. So they have enough issues to deal with. Then make them responsible for getting the word out about the speed chains is unfair. So we just, that was, and I just sent a letter to the two homeowner associations and the neighborhood council explaining why we made those changes based on the number of crashes and number of people that have actually been run over. So when you explain things ahead of time, I think we can definitely get a lot of people on board and be supportive, as opposed to I just don't think it's fair to just let the school take on this endeavor on top of everything else that they have to manage.
That's good input. We'll definitely think about ways that we can proactively get information to school and lead with safety.
Yeah. And I'm happy to help as well, but
Great, thank you.
get a school in my district.
We'll get there, Councilwoman. We will get there.
And I have to ask about that specifically for Hamilton High School, which is a school that is in CD5. The majority of students come from across the street and further in CD10. It's both a neighborhood school and a magnet school. And I don't know the number of accidents, but there's been at least one high-profile accident. We had a traffic fatality with a special needs student. Now, it sounds like the only thing that would keep it out of consideration is the fact that it's on a major street, it's on Robertson, it's near National, and it's near the Freeway, and it's near an expo stop. So I don't know if that is an argument for it or an argument against it based on the criteria. it sounds like it would automatically be excluded because it's on a major street. And I'm not entirely clear why that is.
That's correct. That was just written into the legislation that you cannot implement a 15-mile-an-hour zone on a street that has more than 2 lanes. And so that's why, I mean, that's just the way that the legislation is written. So from what we learn here, we may decide that we want to request a change in that legislation. And in the meantime, we'll certainly take a look at Hamilton High School. I suspect that your analysis is correct, but we'll take a look.
Yeah,
And I would just add to that, again, Salita mentioned how this has been closely coordinated with LAPD. And one of the things when discussing this approach with LAPD, they're in great favor of implementing this 15-mile-an-hour zone on local streets in residential neighborhoods. But if you look at doing 15 miles an hour on an arterial, the prevailing thought is that actually creates more congestion and then ultimately more crashes because people are going from 35 or 45 down to 15 and then back up to 35, 45, and it's this, it creates this bottleneck. And so, again, when discussing is that something we even, we want to explore in this pilot, our partners at the police department said, well, no, let's focus on local streets for this approach, but as Salita said, we'll take a look at Hamilton High.
Appreciate it.
NAVA, it was back in 2007 when it was passed.
From Santa Barbara.
Yes. Okay.
Or former colleague.
Okay, so without objection, the item is...
Well, if I can recommend, as amended, there was a technical correction on attachment B, so we need to substitute that the clerk has. So if you could approve that as amended.
Thank you. So approved as amended as technical correction. Seeing no further business, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.